Greetings to all the viewers of the Dr. Obotashaka show. I want to remind all of you that this show is now simulcast on Facebook and YouTube. So, you Facebook friends um, who formerly had no way to see this show on Facebook, now you can see it both on Facebook and YouTube. So if you want to see it on Facebook, then check out Dr. Obotashaka, and we'll have the show listed on Facebook. Brother Ugawa, as usual, the first one on. And then Stephen McKenzie, greetings to both of you. So for Facebook friends, this show is simulcast, and you can catch it on both Facebook and YouTube. And pretty soon we'll have it on other platforms. For those who watch the show and don't subscribe, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're doing the show a disservice. Hit the subscriber button and subscribe so that we can increase our subscriptions, which also puts us in a better position with the algorithms, and we can deliver a better message to more people. So subscription's important. Each show, I remind people that we'll be doing a webinar when we have enough people enrolled on the sixfold stages to mental freedom. The sixfold stages to mental freedom defines the stages that we go through when we're waking up, but it's an experience, and the webinar is going to take you through an experience. And generally, we're used to learning something just through information. The sixfold stages to mental freedom is a process for transformation, and it's one that arises out of the organic nature of the Black freedom movement of the 50s and 60s and the African liberation movements in Africa and the movements for change in the Caribbean. This also applies to people of color, because while the situation may be slightly different when it comes to oppression, those people of color that face colonialism, those Africans that face colonialism, went through some similar stages, and those who went through enslavement did also, and then some in the Caribbean, enslavement and colonialism. And believe it or not, you're in a form of what I call semi-colonialism in this country today, where the police occupy our communities and perform roles very much that the slave patrols played on the plantation. So the resistance movements of the 60s produced transformation. And some of us that went through it, myself and Bulanlela Wabogo, clocked it and defined it. And then I've added some stuff to it based on experience. So this is really how we learn or know, by being what we know. And in this case, being African, which is not an easy thing to sell some of our people. Shouldn't be, but if you understand our history, you'd understand why. So this is extremely important because it helps to ground you in self-knowledge, not only of your personal self, but of your collective self. And it helps you to ground you in a deeper sense of self-respect and a deep sense of self-love, which is inseparable from the knowledge, respect, and love of your people and of humanity. And so it introduces into your life solid foundation that gives you a greater balance, sense of peace, and a sense of purpose. Not that I'm saying people lack it. I'm simply saying that under oppression, we have disturbances, both internal and external. And the sixfold stages helps us to rise above it, do like Malcolm did, rise above the mud of oppression, and as many of our people have done. The last two shows, I have focused on African and New African philosophy. And by New African, for people that aren't familiar with this term, I'm referring to African American philosophy. And in the first of this series on this, I was dealing with how the Dogon synthesized masculine and feminine internally, inside of a person, and in the cosmos. And that was important because in dealing with what does it mean to be a man or a woman, and in dealing with what does it mean to be in harmony with nature, we have to be in harmony with ourselves. And on one level, that's the masculine and feminine dimensions of being human. On another level, it's got to do with identity and other things. And so there's a connection between the internal harmony we have as men and women and the external harmony we have with the cosmos. And today I'm going to be dealing with the subject very much tied to that. Hey, Robin, my dedicated people are coming in first. And I appreciate y'all's comments too and insights. So the first of this is a third of a series. Of this series was on Dogon philosophy and then African American philosophy. To enable us to have a closer affinity with, harmony with, and a balance with nature and the cosmos, because we have an awesome responsibility as human beings to the cosmos and to humanity and to ourselves. The last week's topic was the spirituals are the blues, and this is one of my favorite subjects. By the way, when you see me wearing this outfit, well, I'm getting into us. You know what I mean? This new African, but also the African, with Miles on one side there. You see with the trumpet. You know what I mean? And I got his picture on the back. This is an artist who put this together at a Monterey Jazz Festival many years ago, and made this himself. So I'm putting this on to make a message, a big message too. So last week's topic was the spirituals are the blues. That was kind of an unusual message because people would, uh, if they're in this at all, think about the blues are the spirituals because they're dealing with chronology. And so last week I was showing you that the spirituals are the blues because they're more about everyday life than about heaven, but they are very much about the spirit. And so it's not a question of which came first, because an African thought and New African thought that's an outgrowth of it in a creative form, um, things are twin. And so it's never going to be one way. And so in the case of the spirituals, it's going to be the blues. And the blues doesn't mean what you think it means, down. No, literally, it's talking about the realities that we face on earth and literally about man and woman, which goes back to the masculine and feminine Dogon thought. And a lot of musicians will tell you the only distinction between gospel and blues is God on the one hand and man and the woman on the other hand. You know what I mean? But those aren't separate, since God resides inside of each of us. So if some people got the point that I was just dealing with the music, then they missed the point, and I don't think you missed it. I'm dealing with the deep thought up underneath it, which comes from the beautiful sound and the beautiful messages that I think pleases God. It has to, because this is just beauty beyond beauty, created under nightmare circumstances. So what does that say about the people who created this music? What does it say about you? But not just the music, the culture, the art form that this is the foundation of, and the depth of thought that is healing when it's internalized. That's again why you need to get into the sixfold stages to mental freedom. So this show last week was for the purpose of showing the unity between sacred and secular, spiritual and material, or spirit and matter, or spirit and humans. And it was showing you can't have one without the other. So that was the dimension of last week's show. And the overall purpose was to show you that by drawing on both the union of the sacred and the secular, or spirit and body, or mind and spirit, what we're doing is we are connecting ourselves to the cosmos and to Mother Earth, and of course, bringing about a greater balance and synthesis inside ourselves. So that was the real purpose. But when you're guided by a philosophy that stands on a foundation of beauty, and then it applies to everything around you, then that's not only profound, that's inspirational. That's what picks you up, you know? And most of us, we got to have music all around us. Because as Pythagoras said, who was a Greek initiate into the Kemetic system over 20 years, he said that the planets emit music. It's just at such a high vibratory pitch, the human ear can't hear it. Which, among other things, means God's not only a great artist and a great scientist, but a great musician. I mean, if there's ultimate beauty, then that is the beauty of God, which resides inside of each one of us. So my topic for today, and by the way, I had trouble figuring out what was the topic going to be for this week, because it comes through inspiration. Even though I know I need to be mapping stuff out, I got to be inspired. And it wasn't until yesterday that I came up with this topic. Don't think it means I'm not prepared, because I put a lot of time into this over the years, and then in preparing for this. So my topic for today, you can consider to be part 3 of these last 3 weeks. This is part 3. And this comes from my forthcoming book, Seba, To Know the Truth is to Be the Truth. That's not the whole title, but that's the essence of it. And so the topic for today, some of you have received the promotional leaflet, and those that haven't, the topic is, quote, spirit science, guided by the philosophy of Maat and the spiritual blues, the way to save the planet from ecocide. Now, I'm going to only hit the top on this. There's a lot to this. And so I'm just hitting the top. And it's an important subject, because if your mother's being attacked, then you're going to be the first one to come to her defense. Nothing more precious in your life than mama. Well, what about Big Mama being attacked? That's Mother Nature. And then what about the fact that if you throw this out of balance, and this is definitely out of balance, but it can go to such a point where this planet will become uninhabitable for various life forms, then you're going to throw the cosmos out of balance. You know what I mean? And so we should all consider it our task to be on a rescue mission. But then we got to be clear about what is it that we face, and what is the real problem that underlies this thing called global warming, that puts the planet in a position, what I call ecocide, which is genocide of the planet. That is a its ability for us to live on it, you know? So as humans, we have a special mission. And that mission is to serve as guardians of this planet. But a lot of us don't know it. And certainly we're living in a society, in a world in which guardianship is as far from the minds of particularly those who are in charge of this system that is messing the planet up. It's as far from their mind as possible. So the topic again is spirit science, guided by the philosophy of Maat and the spiritual blues. The way to save the planet from ecocide. So I'm suggesting, I'm starting off with this, that the salvation is more than it may appear to be for this planet. More, you know, it's got to do with how you view yourself in the world. In this case, the philosophy of Ma'at. And it's got to do with how you see the world and how you conceptualize it. And that's got to do with the spiritual blues. These two are the way to save the planet from ecocide, along with other measures. We'll see why these two, the overriding philosophy of Ma'at and the overriding deep thought deriving from that philosophy, of the spiritual blues. This is the path for saving the planet from ecocide. Now, this is obviously a timely topic given the Glasgow summit that's going on global warming. But I'd be having this topic anyway, whether that summit was going on or not. But it just happens to fit to be timely. I just had to get the inspiration. And the Spirit said, do this one. So I'm doing this one. This is a timely topic, summit or no summit, because the planet is on the brink of becoming uninhabitable for human life and other life forms. We're close to the brink. Hopefully, we haven't gone over it. But there's very little time left to make this planet an inhabitable place for lives and lives to come. Now, approximately 10,000 BC, which is about the time that the Anu founded Kemet, the concentration of carbon had stabilized. And the concentration of the stabilization of carbon led to predictable seasons and to reliable living weather that could be predicted, and weather in which, if you're in a place like the Nile Valley or other places, you could construct civilization. Humanity had lived a lot longer than this 10,000 years in a hunter-gatherer state. But in this agrarian state particularly, the stabilization of carbon was extremely important for the development of civilization. And we know the greatest on the planet, ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. So over a long period of human history, our carbon levels were stable. Now, scientists will now note that, but then they won't know why. They won't know why. Why? Because Africans, Asians, and Native Americans all had a conception of what it means to be human, in which they viewed themselves and we viewed ourselves as an inseparable part of the cosmos, as an extension of Mother Nature, of a miniature cosmos within a larger one. We've been talking about this before. And so they were protective of the environment because they understood that in protecting the environment, they were protecting themselves. And as a result, um, Africans and people of color managed nature quite well and understood exactly what they were doing in the course of that. Among our Native American brothers and sisters who are master environmentalists, if you want to use that term, they were such great caretakers of Mother Earth, Mother Nature, and the cosmos that they inflicted a capital fine, that is a death, on anyone that polluted the water, because water is the stream of life. Basically, 75% of a human being is water. That's the composition of water on Mother Earth. We're miniature reflections of this larger Earth and the cosmos. And so some people will say, oh, capital punishment is wrong. And I frown on it myself. But I could understand the point that this is about as bad as it gets, because if you're poisoning water, you're poisoning life, the stream of life, you know? And as a lot of philosophers say, water has no enemies. Of course, when it's a flood, you might debate that. But water is your source of life. So Africans, Asians, Native Americans, we had an understanding of our link to the cosmos and to Mother Nature. And none of these societies were perfect. They all had their imbalances, but we maintained a kind of balance on Earth where it was livable and the atmosphere wasn't being poisoned. So, what's placed the planet on the endangered habitable list? What makes this planet be in a position where we may not be able to live on it by the end of some of our lifetimes? What is it? What's the cause of what's called the climate crisis? Now, on the surface, it's pretty clear. It's the Industrial Revolution, which should be called industrial pollution. Industrial Revolution, my butt. There was a beautiful brother named Russell Means, who was a spokesperson. He gave up the title of leader of the American Indian movement, AIM, and he said, you can measure what you call revolution in the West by its impact on people of color. And I would add the planet. And so the Industrial Revolution was viewed as progress, of course, with a great deal of exploitation. And of course, it was based on the foundation of slavery and then genocide. But it was a system that clearly was the basis for the burning of fossil fuels and the destruction of nature, the release of carbon in the atmosphere to ridiculously high levels. So the Industrial Revolution definitely played a role, a big role. It is the primary cause mechanically of the crisis that the Earth faces. And since we now know, those who were doing it then should have known there were better ways to do this. You didn't have to go this route. And I'm going to discuss why they went this route. This is the real key question. So, what we've seen as a result of what is the overall cause for the warming of the planet, for endangering this place as a living space for humans and other life forms, is that over the past 40 years, particularly, the planet has been getting extremely warmer. The hottest years in the history of the planet has occurred since 1998. The surface temperature of the Earth has gone up from 1 degree Fahrenheit since the 1800s. Most of this has increased over the last 30 years. So the heating of the planet is real key. And then what we have with this, the increase in atmospheric temperature has been caused by the overloading of the atmosphere with carbon dioxide that traps heat and continuously drives up the Earth's temperature. This is caused by the Industrial Revolution that should have been described, as I said before, as industrial pollution. So carbon pollution comes from fossil fuels that humans burn for energy, including coal and natural gas, and from the loss of forests that also leads to the increase in the Earth's atmosphere. And we're seeing that the rainforests in Brazil and other places being attacked regularly, and a lot have been destroyed for the timber industry for profit. And this again is making this Earth a possible uninhabitable place if this isn't corrected. The oceans have warmed, and this is extremely important, leading to the increased heat to the top of 700 meters above 2,300 feet of ocean warming by 302 degrees Fahrenheit since 1969. In other words, the oceans are getting hotter, and this destroys life forms, that many of which are already destroyed, that live in the ocean. And then we know global warming is contributing to rising sea levels caused by the melting of the polar ice caps in Alaska and other places. And so sea levels have increased by 8 inches in the last 100 years. 8 inches in the last 100 years, sea levels have increased. And already in the South Pacific, there are islands that have been destroyed. And islands where people literally, their houses are barely above water. And by the way, the people who are suffering the environmental crisis first, people of color, the South Pacific, Africa, Asia, Latin America, these are the people that didn't cause the pollution. Most of them haven't seen any industries, but they're the ones that are suffering. While the Jeff Bezos and everybody else is going off like fat rats, and doing everything they can to stall anything being done to stop this in the name of profit. So we've seen then this problem of the rising of sea level. So you can predict in so many years, there are whole cities that are going to be gone, or parts of them, around the country, particularly those that are right on, the ocean. And then with this, we've seen extremes in weather patterns, severe storms, tornadoes, and tornadoes occurring in places where they've never occurred before, So I started off this discussion by talking about the surface, which is very important, the Industrial Revolution, and the burning of fossil fuels and the heating of the planet and the rising of the waters. When I say it's surface, that's what's obvious as the cause. And these causes have to be remedied. I'm not suggesting that we go on with this industrial revolution. I mean, wind and solar are clearly alternatives to this. Electric vehicles, and I drive a car. So I'm not saying I'm free from this. I drive a car. Most of us do. So on the surface, it's these mechanical things that have to be corrected, which the leading polluters of the planet, America, Europe, and now China and Japan. China is a major polluter now, but it's America that's been doing, and the Western world that has been doing most of the pollution. So these are the main emitters of the problem. And they're the ones that are often doing very little to correct them. The Chinese have done a lot in solar energy, for example. They have the leading solar energy industry in the world, but they're also polluting. Right now, heavily in coal because they got some energy problems in China. But they have made some commitments, but not enough. And in the United States, they do everything they can to stop it. You know what I mean? To prevent it from happening so that whatever happens ends up being a compromise. Um, Here, Stephen McKenzie is talking about if fossil fuels are plants and animals, what makes it harmful is the plants and animals is something that man adds to it. Particularly cows and stuff, methane, they contribute to that. But if you didn't have the Industrial Revolution, you could probably get by with it. But with the Industrial Revolution, then maximum level of poisoning going on. But agriculture brought in its own problems. So the question is, what's the underlying causes of this climatic crisis that imperils Mother Earth as a livable place? Because if we only deal with the symptoms, that's kind of like taking a major wound and putting a Band-Aid on it, and then letting the person die from gangrene or whatever it is, But if we only deal with the surface, then even if we slow emissions of fossil fuels, if the same system that led to this continues, and I'm suggesting that system is more than just the mechanics of an industrial revolution, it's in the philosophy of the people that created that system. And that's what nobody deals with. The environmentalists have all got their little quick fixes. And it's all got to do with measures. And those measures are important. So I'm not knocking the measures. And in fact, they need to be at maximum level, But they're not getting into what is it that led to this. This is the key point. And so I would start with my master, Dr. Jacob Carruthers. Now give credit where credit is due. He described the philosophy of Western science as a mad philosophy, therefore he called it a mad science. I don't want to confuse the two. I'm not putting down science. I'm putting down the philosophy of science and the methodology that is then used to carry out a mad philosophy. And I'm centering this on particularly the despiritualized nature of Western science. That is, I think, the major reason for the planet being put on a life support almost status right now. It's this despiritualized philosophy of the Western world that has given rise to a despiritualized science. And it also ties into the dehumanization that comes out of the West that gets later linked to racism. But I'm not dealing with racism here because that ain't the cause of the environment being in crisis. But when you take spirit out of anything, then it's dehumanized. If it's human, take that out, then you can do anything you want to it. But here, I'm dealing more with taking the spirit out of the culture in general, and particularly in the way in which the culture has approached the planet. And so fix-it solutions, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. Now, if we're going to diagnose this properly, I thought that one of the best ways is to look at the observations of one of our greatest scholars, Dr. Shekinah Diop. And I am looking at what he had to say about the cause of this. He's addressing one part. There are other parts to this, of this environmental crisis. He wasn't talking about an environmental crisis. He was talking about the fundamentals of Hellenistic or Greek thought. That's what he was talking about. But basically, that is really identifying the basis for the problem that we face right now. And so Dr. Diop is also important because he was not only a historian, but a scientist, a physicist. And so he's also looking at this through both eyes, and an African and a spiritual person too. So this is what Diop had to say. And I'm going to have more to say than this, but I think this is fundamental, what he says here. Quote, "It's impossible to stress all that the Hellenistic world owed to the Egyptian." Hellenistic, the Greeks. "The Greeks merely continued and developed, sometimes partially, what the Egyptians had invented." Now, this is a little bit more than George James. And George James talks about in Stolen Legacy that Greek philosophy was stolen Egyptian philosophy. And there's truth to that. But what he missed was, what's Greek in it? You know, if they were just manifesting Kemetic or Egyptian thought, then you could accuse them of being imitators, expropriators, but chances are their stuff wouldn't be putting the planet in peril. So there's something they added, you know what I mean? And in fact, you can't take on another people's culture wholesale. For example, I know white musicians who are really conscious, they'll make the point that when they're playing rhythm and blues or whatever, they will say, we're interpreters of this, you know, meaning they ain't of this. They ain't black. They ain't had the experience. And so the Greeks could take from the Egyptians or the Kemites, but they're Greek. So it's going to be turned around, even if they didn't intend to, because that's the nature of culture. You're going to see things through your own eyes. So this is what Diop adds here that George James didn't talk about. So, you know, let me repeat this one so you get the flow of this. He said, "The Greeks merely continued and developed, sometimes partially, what the Egyptians had invented." And then this is where he shows the add-on. "By virtue of their materialistic tendencies, the Greeks stripped those inventions of their religious idealistic shell in which the Egyptians had developed them." In other words, what they're bringing in is, the Greeks are bringing in, is a materialistic view of things, very different from the Kemetic view, which Diop is saying was religious. And then he goes on and he says, once they had borrowed Egyptian values, the worldly genius of the Greeks emanating from their religious indifferences favored the existence of a secular worldly science. Get this straight. This is good observation on his part. And what he means is a science stripped of what he calls religion. I'm going to correct that. But science that didn't have anything to do with anything other than what was material. Okay, this is his point. Now, I cite this because Diop's observations are profound and basically accurate, though I'm going to refine it. Because when, well, first of all, he's basically right in saying that the Greeks stripped Kemetic thought of a spiritual essence. But you'll see why I have some quarrels with exactly what's meant by this term. So he's right when he says that, you know, they took Kemetic ideas and turned them into purely materialistic ideas, secular ideas. He's right. But when he says that the Greeks stripped Egyptian ideas of religious ideas, that's incorrect. And you got to be real clear about this, because the term religion cannot be found, the word, in any African language. There's no word for religion. That is a Roman word, religio, meaning binding together Christianity with non-Christian ideas. That's religio. Religions have three qualities that the Kemites didn't have. Prophets, that's one. Laws, that's two. And books. Now, you'll say they have books, but we're always misinterpreting this and trying to take various quotes that come out of Kemetic thought and turn them into Bibles. They didn't have any because they didn't have any religion. Why? Because African systems are all spirit systems, not spiritual. There's no word for spiritual either. That's a theory. Spirit is reality. When I told you I see this light, or the spirit told me to do this, or you say the same thing, you know darn well what that is. That's not a theory. That's God speaking to you. That's the spirit inside of you. That's when, that series we went through on God within, that's heart mind, where God resides inside the soul of each person. That ain't no theory, So that's what they took out. They didn't take no religion out. They took out spirit. You hear me? And left in its place something purely devoid of spirit, purely physical, or purely material. And this is an important point to get because remember, P.A.P.O is Islamic, but he's coming out of an African-based Islam, which has spirit all over it. And remember the thing we did with Theophilo Benga, showing that P.A.P.O could get right to something, the answer for something without using Descartes' reasoning process. That's the guy that I think, therefore I am. I'm going to go into him in a minute. I mean, he taught the French how to think. Why in the hell you have to teach anybody how to think? You're born with the capacity to think. You got to be pretty backward to do that. One course I refused to teach at San Francisco State, I had to teach it once and I taught it by not teaching it, was critical thinking. I said, critical BS. You hear me? Because everybody's born with the capacity to think. As one of my former students, who's my age, Shabaza Sadifu, he may be 2 years younger than me, I learned from him. He's very smart, and he's one of the brothers that's run our school, African Children's Advanced Learning Center. He made the point that the only thing people really need to do to really think clearly is to have something to think with. Appropriate framework, appropriate information. You know what I mean? Our thinking is thrown off when we're thinking someone else's thoughts. So critical thinking, nothing. It's white people invented that. And all Black studies courses have them. Critical thinking classes. You want to have a course, have one on creative thinking. And you'd be wasting your time on that because you can't teach that. That comes from within you. And by the way, that's a key part of this discussion today. Creativity, baby. You know what I mean? Remember I said it's our ethos, but it's the nature of being human. And that's what also happens when you get that masculine feminine thing going at synthesis inside the person, and males and females in balance in society. You got to have just societies, but you can reproduce this in your families, baby. You know what I mean? Huh? And that's where happiness comes from. Treat your lady right. Treat your man right. You know what I mean? Treat yourself right. You know what I mean? So spirit is what was taken out, not religion. That wasn't the problem. The problem was in creating a material reality, it was devoid of spirit. And but it's not, because all humans are basically spirit beings. We're spirits having a physical experience. Everything that God created, it's got spirit in it, which means intelligence in it. So why is it that we didn't have the prophet, the book, and the laws? You know what I mean? Well, first of all, we had a God we could believe in. And by the way, we all have the same God. We just got different names, different concepts, and all the rest of that. But we knew God wasn't a control freak. In fact, the whole purpose of being human is to make your own choices. In fact, in the African view, we've gone over this before. I know some of you question it. Some of you are thinking about it, and some of you may believe it, that in heaven we picked our path on earth. And we do know that we got a thing called free will. It's counteracted by environment, it's counteracted by all kinds of experiences and culture and whatnot. So free will, sometimes we'll cave into what society does to us, the abuses it does, and it can shape us, or the way we were raised. If it was off, it can throw us out of balance. But in the end, we have choices. That's the nature of being a human being. And so in Kemet and African civilizations in general, and the fundamental principle of African American culture is spirit. And spirit is a God that resides within us. It's the force of life that sustains everything, even inanimate. So that's what they took out. But they didn't really take it out because it's still there. You know what I mean? But it's got you to question it, to be afraid of it. If you experience your own internal spiritual powers, some spirit powers, some people just don't want to face that. And yet that's your higher powers. But that's someone else's view of you, seeing yourself spiritually through someone else's eyes. So what the Greeks did was strip Kemetic ideas and contributions of the spirit essence, leading to a despiritualized culture, which it already was. And the very few among them that took on this culture, this African culture, like Pythagoras, were extreme minorities, within their so-called civilization. And so then taking spirit out wasn't just taking it out of science. It was taking it out of culture, because that was the inclination of the Aryan or the Greek anyway. And this is a central feature of not only Greek culture, but of Western culture, of Aryan culture in general. And I might say this, Indo-Aryans, which is the Indians, Indo-Aryan, these are the Aryans who conquered India. They have a spirit-based religious system. That is, it's in a book, but it is a lot of the profound stuff has got the wisdom of the Dravidians or the Dalits about the soul, about eternal life. It's a lot of profound stuff. But then there's distortions. But the key thing is, when you cut up underneath this, if you read their holy book, the Gita, which has got a lot of profound wisdom in it, what you find is that this Aryan is still focused on control, which becomes a key part of their ethos, even though on the surface there's more of a spirit and particularly religious dimension. So, with Indo-Aryan, slightly different. With Western Aryan, both Eastern European and Western European, it's pretty much the Greek thing all the way down. So de-spiritualization then is the system where spirit is separate from mind, spirit is separate from matter, spirit is separate from nature. And it is this project of de-spiritualization that has been very successful, launched particularly by Greek thought, particularly, and embraced by Western or Aryan thought in general, that is a primary cause for planetary ecocide if it happens, and is a primary cause for global warming. Planetary ecocide is planetary genocide, or genocide of life-sustaining qualities that this planet produces. Despiritualization is at the core of the planetary crisis because by despiritualizing nature, Western man has materialized it. In doing so, Western science has objectified nature, denying its spirit essence, making it a subject for control and destruction. That's a real key thing. If you objectify something, separate yourself from it. Treat it as just a material object. Well, what's wrong with tearing it up, destroying it, and everything else? It would be quite different if you saw nature as intelligent, possessing wisdom, having healing qualities that you need to know. You would approach nature very differently. And it's obvious without Big Mama, you don't exist. So de-spiritualization is at the foundation of ecocide and the attack on the planet. Just as racism served as an idea, and I want to get this straight, I'm not referring to Black people, the idea of dehumanization, that is, whites treating people of color, including Africans, as not being human. Therefore, you can go off and genocide them. You're not killing people, you know? And that's what you're seeing with the C.O.R.E trial right now. You know what I mean? It took 3 months to put these 3 killers on trial. 3 months. Because they figured, hey, it's like shooting a dog. He's running, shoot him. And we can say whatever we want. They were surprised that they were ever arrested. And it took 3 months. And a near all-white jury, you know. And they were receiving all kinds of dog whistles right after they did it. Oh, great. You know what I mean? Blah, blah. Huh. So taking spirit out of nature is in some ways comparable to taking the humanity out of people of color. You know what I mean? Each one is a form of, in this case, stripping nature of its qualities, its life-giving qualities, and in this, you know, other than the physical ones, and in the case of the human being, of stripping them of, in their view, of having any humane qualities. And of course, we know the stripping process of denying your history and everything else that goes on to this day as a part of that. So there's a comparable thing there. And by the way, a people capable of genocide, ecocide is just automatic. You hear me? Think about that one. A people who went around wiping out everybody they could get their hands on it. So science now confirms, as I've noted previously, some of you who are scientists, and I'm not claiming to be, it's not one of my gifts. I respect those that have it, it's not mine. But science now confirms that human beings are a miniature part of nature and the cosmos, and we're inseparable from Mother Nature and the cosmos. So if we harm nature, we harm ourselves. If we harm the cosmos, we harm ourselves. And so get this. This is the overall thrust for this one here. And you'll see what I base this on in the conclusion. To save the planet, we're going to have to move away from a despiritualized philosophy and a despiritualized science, and we must embrace a sacred secular philosophy, which is contained in the spiritual blues, guided by Maat, but we must embrace a spirit science to take place of a despiritualized science. This is the real key point. And this is because if your science is going to be accurate, then it must mirror, it must reflect the truths of its subject, in this case, Earth and the cosmos. And everything that God created that's visible has both a material and what science would call an energy essence. But that energy essence is spirit. Waves and particles in quantum physics, that's an energy. That is the spirit. Those who correctly define Ma'at, or what the Chinese call Tao, the way, or Ma'at, the rudder of heaven, the beam of earth, the beautiful truth, describe it as energy. It's a force. And most Black people believe that, because when we do right, we usually say, like my good neighbor who fixed my roof, I've referred to it before when I first moved into this house, 7 hours on the roof with my stepson. And I said, what do I owe you? He said, you don't owe me anything. He said, what goes around comes around. When I'm done here, it'll come back to me. Because we understand there's cosmic law out there. You might not think so, but hey, right gets rewarded and wrong gets punished. But it's hard to prove because there's a lot of wrong people getting away with mass murder. So anyone that questions this, I have to admit, that ain't easy to answer. But ultimately, I think we all know this. But of course, I don't rely just on spirit power. Praise the Lord and pass me something. You know what I'm talking about? Some power, baby. But spirit power is at the heart of all the rest of it. But you better have some other power too. They'll make those who mess with you back off. Power, baby. But disconnected from spirit, it's weak. Disconnected from truth, it's wrong. You know? So I'm saying that to save the planet, we need a spirit science, because matter and spirit are inseparable in nature. And if you're going to have a science that can guide us in saving the planet, then that science has got to be imbued not only with a recognition of energy and spirit, but the philosophy that guides it. And that's the philosophy of Maat. Spirit isn't just raw energy then. It's a God force. And that God force is Ma'at, or Tao. You know, the Chinese T.A.O., they define Tao as the way. It's real subtle the way they define it. We call it the rudder of heaven, the beam of earth. It's the invisible direction of the cosmos. It's the center point of the earth, which means it's your center point. So the spiritual blues rest on a sacred secular union that manifests cosmic logic. That is sacred and secular logic. It's powerful because of that. It carried us through the greatest hell that any people have faced. And not just the spiritual blues, the whole spirit powers that are infused in all human beings, but are central to our culture. It carried us through. And it carries us through today if we draw from it, along with all the other things we do to see that our lives are livable, and to see that the burdens are taken off the shoulders of our people and off of humanity. So the spiritual blues and Ma'at connect humanity to nature and encourages humanity to achieve internal harmony, to be in possession and mastery of their internal forces, something that we talked about when I was going through the Bombara. And when we have internal balance, masculine, feminine synthesis, then we're in a position to be cosmic guardians and cosmic balancers, something that de-spiritualized thinkers don't even think about. They're just looking at plunder and wealth and power. And by the way, I'm pointing you to something else. The demographics in this country are shifting. Power is going to shift. The people in power doing everything they can through crook and and every other way to hold themselves in power, keeping you out of the ballot and whatnot. You know what I mean? It's like trying to forestall a tide. You can't stop it, baby. The question is, what are we going to do to prepare for this shift? And we have to prepare our children to live in a world in which we're running things, along with other people of color and those whites that have sense. You know, I don't exclude anybody that's on the right side, but you got to prepare for that now. You got to get out of what you think is the blues, which is wrapped up in, oh, woe is they're doing this and that to me, which they may be doing. So what are you doing to get it off of you? And part of it is to prepare for a world in which you can really appreciate the beauty of what's around you. And that, of course, means having a full stomach. That means having a roof over your head. That means having the power and the freedom to be whatever those talents inside of you say you have the potential to be, you know? So that's all a part of it. This isn't just about the external environment. It's your own internal environment as well. So Aryan philosophy and the Greek model for Western materialization has put Western man, Western science, and humanity on a collision course because it's created a false reality devoid of spirit. It's created a mentality of de-spiritualization, and it rests on a material culture, in this case Greek, but also Aryan in general. One of the exponents of this culture was a Greek philosopher whose name was Parmenides. And this was his assertion. And this is about as empty as you can get. He said this, and I quote him, "There is being, but there is no non-being." This is the essence of the materialist view of the Greeks and of Western thinkers and culture in general, which is saying that only matter exists. Nothing else exists. By the way, what does that say about your thoughts? That means that since you can't see your thoughts, they don't exist either? Huh? Really? You know? While Africans and people of color understood that the invisible spirit is a fundamental force of life, both animate and inanimate, and quantum physics rests on the understanding that energy is a force, and it's a force that runs through all life forms, which I'm saying is spirit. Greek philosophy asserted the spiritually empty idea that, listen to this, and this can cause some people to commit suicide, by the way, if this is how you think. From nothing, nothing occurs. Gee, really? From a womb that didn't have life, that is a new life, comes a seed out of which comes an embryo, out of which comes life. A cosmos that exists, that comes out of the infinitely small, but before that didn't exist. According to quantum physics, before the Big Bang, this big place wasn't here. The Dogon call it the Big Burst, and they say it came from a dwarf star Sirius B. We've gone through this before. So, really? From nothing, nothing comes? Of course, you're going to see, you especially believe this if you're putting God out of the picture. Not religion, God. You know what I mean? So the Greeks went so far as to say this, and these were atomists, Atomist. Yes. That sounds profound because they were talking about atomic theory, but they were kind of off in what the atom was and everything else. But this is the key point that they made, that the soul, now this is, one of the higher forces that, entities have, in this case, the human entity, one of the most noble ideas, the soul, but not just an idea, a reality. This was their comment, that the soul is formed by extremely fine material atoms that dissolve at death. In other words, this soul that you can't see is supposed to be made up of atoms that the Greeks treated like the atom was material. But the key point they make is that with death, the soul decomposes, doesn't exist anymore. There's no life after death. So their reality was matter is all that matters. Get all you can get right now. You hear me? And that's the thought underneath which global warming is occurring and everything else. Human misery is occurring. And of course, with that view, it's quick to commit suicide. You're quick to commit it. Easy. You know what I mean? Africans, even though the suicide rates are going up among some young blacks, it's still lower than among whites, because we have some belief that what goes around comes around. No matter how bad things are, they can get better. And we also have an understanding there's something eternal inside of us. And depending on how grounded you are, you have a sense that as bad as this situation is, it can get better. And so a lot of our people who have gone through the worst crisis in life, when they come out, if they've learned anything, those are some of our most highly evolved human beings. You know, ex-drug addicts. Malcolm X, look at him. He exaggerated his criminal background, but look at him. Look how he rose and transformed, you know, through gone through the trials of life. That's what makes you stronger. A fall in the pit can lead to motherwit, you know? So we don't welcome these, we don't want them. But as the great Buddha taught, embrace adversity. You might as well, because you're going through it. You need to figure out how to handle it. And life has that. That the most rewarding parts of life are sometimes the worst parts, because that's where the big lessons are, you know? And it's all a question of how do you approach it? And I always find that with people who've been able to negotiate it, they've always got some positive way to take lemons and turn them into lemonade. You know what I mean? They got some positive way to do that. That's my philosophy. Something goes wrong, I'm going to work on it, own my part, and take the best out of it I can. You know what I mean? And hope it's over. I'm human. I ain't looking forward to this. I'm not into pain as something rewarding. I don't like pain. But you got to go through it, man. Get it over. But you've got to figure it out. And that's to embrace it. Learn from it. And you come out of it. You might even be able to help other people to negotiate that. So, what a spiritually empty world. No soul, huh? But then Plato takes this to another level. And Plato plays a big role in creating a new type of man or woman. His main emphasis was on the man, but, you know, Western person. Plato plays a big role in shaping this and plays a big role in the de-spiritualization. And he's complex because he's heavily influenced by Kemetic thought, but very Greek at the same time. So I passed on this briefly before, but I didn't go into it. And there's more even that I'm not going into now, but I can get to the essence of this. Plato took Egyptian ideas of great merit, and he took those ideas and created systems of thought that removed spirit from the equation. But he did it in such subtle ways that you might not see this as de-spiritualization. But let's see what he did. Um, and by doing this, what he did is, as he took spirit out of the equation, he put in its place de-spiritualized reasoning man, and it's literally man. Reasoning man, man who reasons without intuition, without emotion. And he puts God to the side. God's in the picture, so this is where you can get confused with Plato, because God's not completely out of the picture. Hesiod, the same thing. He's really the author of some of the real interesting stuff in Greek thought. I'm not going to go into it, but God's in the picture. But what kind of God? This is another question. But Plato takes an idea that his teacher Socrates gained from the Egyptians or the Kemites. And it was the idea of the form. Now, why am I going to this? Because it's again showing you how the West put itself on this path of despiritualization. And this is a big part of the problem. And this idea that Plato comes up with here, which is a distortion of Kemetic ideas that P.A.P.O was talking about, materializing them heavily, in this case, despiritualizing them, plays a big part in this anti-nature project, let alone anti-humanity. So he took an idea that he got from his teacher Socrates, who got this from the Egyptians, the idea of the form, F-O-R-M. Some of you have heard of this. The idea of the form drew from an Egyptian idea that Socrates taught him, that in heaven, the soul saw pre-existing truths that would then give rise to things. And this was a memory that the soul carried inside itself. So this is some spiritual stuff here, you know. So for the idea of a pre-existing idea, a pre-existing idea that he never mentioned, of course, would be Maat. And we'll see in a few minutes why he didn't mention that. But that would be a pre-existing idea. They would call it an idea. It was really a force of nature and the cosmos. They never referred to this one. But pre-existing idea could be beauty, the idea of beauty. So in what Plato translates from Socrates, so there's this idea of beauty from which a beautiful thing comes. Could be a beautiful person or whatever, a beautiful idea. Now, to best understand what the form is, you need to look at Dogon thought. And in the Dogon, the form that Plato's talking about closely resembles what's called the Dunoso, A-D-U-N-O-S-O, which I've referred to before. And a Dunoso means knowledge of the universe. And these are signs traced on the earth that convey what the West would call symbols or knowledge. Because the Dogon don't write per se, it's an oral transmission, but a Dunoso is their means for transmitting knowledge. But the key point about a Dunoso is that its source is the idea that when God creates the cosmos, God creates it, and this is symbolic, this is not literal, out of God's womb, Amma, A-M-M-A, who is God. But what God creates inside God's womb derives from God's thoughts. And so the idea is the cosmos that's created out of God is an emanation of God's thoughts. It's an interesting idea. But the point is about a Dunoso is that the thought, the source, is even more real than what gives rise to the source. In other words, the spirit, in this case, the thought, which is a spirit, is the source of life. And so in all African so-called deep thought or philosophical systems, while body is real, spirit is more real, because spirit is a source of life for the body. Just as The human being is real, God is more real. You know, you don't see God necessarily except in certain emanations, but it's the source. And so this idea of form is a distortion of some very deep African ideas. And think about it, for human beings, we know this is true. You know, we had a show on abuse and stuff, and sister on the show was talking about basically what you think is what you are. Now, the Nation of Islam had a saying, what you eat is what you are. That's true too. That has an influence, definitely. But thought really is what you are or can become. And so when you think of something, then that's the basis for bringing it into being, you know? So this idea of adunaso, or knowledge of the universe, or the universe being created from God's thoughts, it certainly mirrors what we experience. And a lot of us do this unconsciously. We're not aware that we're manifesting reality through our thoughts. And so we'll say something's not going to happen, this is going to be bad, and so forth. And then it's bad. I've said this before, no good black men out there. So you end up getting a no good black man, or you don't get one at all. But they're all around you, but you don't see them. You know what I mean? Because your thought is making reality. Similarly, if your thought is creative, it makes reality. I was reading some stuff on Alicia Keys, you know what I mean, who's a young singer who I really like. I mean, that sister can sing. She's not just a singer, but a composer. You know what I mean? And she's plays piano, classically trained, and then got off into jazz, blues, rhythm and blues. And she comes from Hell's Kitchen. She didn't come from a nice place. But what's interesting about her is that she took the view that this adversity was good and that it made her tough. You know what I mean? And so when she got into a vulturistic music industry, she kept to the truth of what she's supposed to do, and got out of a bad contract with Columbia and got into Arista Records, and then later followed the guy that brought her in, Clive Davis, into another record company, which he's a case in and of himself. But she had the freedom to do what she wanted to do, and I think got 18 Grammys. You know what I mean? The sister can sing. She got some soul. But the key thing is she took adversity and turned it around. You know what I mean? Turned it around and got a nice positive experience, attitude towards life. I like it. Young sister who's got this old, but her own sound. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. You know what I mean? But that's us. We have that capacity if we go inside ourselves. So God for Plato, now here's the whole thing. With Plato, he takes on this idea of the form. But for Plato, God doesn't create within himself. God creates outside himself, and God creates on the model of the form. Now check what he's doing. He's subordinating God to an idea that he's distorted coming out of Egyptian thought, which the Dogon have similar ideas, because all African philosophies and cultures are very similar. So what he does is, out of the form, he has the highest form, which is good. Good. Remember last week we were talking about the spiritual blues. Good is bad. But in Platonic thought, good is separate from bad. You know what I mean? He creates dichotomy, separation, which is the basic way Western people think, and we've been influenced by it. I had to disengage from this thinking. I didn't know where it came from. I didn't, my miseducation, I didn't know this is Greek and I got this, and I had to rearrange my thought. I was talking about that before. So the form becomes the model for what God creates, not God himself. So that's a despiritualization right there. He's being subordinated, or not he, but God is being subordinated to a form. God ain't even creative. What kind of stuff is this? Um, and then he creates separate forms. Now, Dunoso, which is the Dogon conception of knowledge of the universe, I've said this before, in the smallest part of the Dogon system, a seed, Digitaria exilis, which in Jiriso, Beniso, and Boloso, but particularly Jiriso, knowledge from the front side, Digitaria is the smallest of cereal grains. But in Sodias, Digitarius is Sirius B. But in either one, when you look at how they convey the message of this small cereal grain or anything else that they're conveying on a small level, everything's in it. I call it that within anything is everything principle. African thought is holistic. I know some people have trouble with what I'm doing here. I'm a multidimensional scholar. By the way, when we shifted the paradigm in Africana studies, that was after a retreat. It was during a retreat that Dr. Wade Nobles, Dr. Lawford Goddard, myself, and other faculty members took part in. The only retreat was in 1990 that I ever had without an agenda. I've been chairing Black Studies since '84. And I didn't come in with an agenda. I wanted to find where the discipline needed to go. And so it was Wade's partner, Dr. Lawford Goddard, who made this comment. He said, the discipline, because we were then Black Studies, it's now Africana Studies. He said, the discipline of Black Studies is not interdisciplinary, meaning we got a little psychology here, we got a little, economics here, a little history there, blah, blah. And very often it's chocolate. On the outside is black. On the inside ain't nothing too much changed, except it's Black people you're talking about. You haven't changed the discipline. But then he made this one word because I was looking for how could we hang a discipline shift? What could we hang it on? And he said, our discipline is not interdisciplinary, it's multi-dimensional. And what he was describing was how our best scholars were moving, how Dr. Wade Nobles was moving. Theophil Obenga, who came on later, was moving. A number of us were moving. We weren't specialists in just one area. We were multidimensional, and very often rising out of a discipline. Dr. Nobles has trouble calling himself a psychologist anymore because he's so much into spirit. You know what I mean? And so that's the nature. And in fact, the most radical thing we did with the discipline of Africana studies is we centered it on spirit, which was, and this is, once I heard multidimensional, I'm a historian, philosopher, political person, a bunch of other stuff, I knew how we'd shift the paradigm. African philosophy would drive this, and African American philosophy, because it was a dual shift. And I got Wade on board and a guy named James Todd, who was in a PhD program with me, and they were my center. They supported this. And then Phil McGee, who I referred to last week, a beautiful brother who was dean of the College of Ethnic Studies, all kinds of guts, very creative, not only a psychologist, but a pianist and a trainer of gospel musicians. And he represented Walter Bishop. And he's one of the great gospel singers. And he could take a gospel group that was just average and turn them into something magnificent. And the guy had taste. I mean, he had that artistic thing inside of him. You know what I mean? And so Dean Phil McGee backed me on this. And I talked about this last week in the context of the week before last, in the context of nebulous dualism, that he was able to do when the president said, support me and wiping him out. He'd say, but he never said yes. That meant no. And then because If the president got rid of him before he got rid of us, then he wasn't going to get rid of us. We kicked his butt. That he's going to be in a world of trouble because Phil was loved by everybody. you know. But the key point is this form, Plato separates form from form. Why? For the purpose of control. But the dunoso, or in our case, multidimensional discipline, is everything's interconnected because nature's interconnected. And at the core of it was spirit. You hear me? Spirit. Because that's the way I always taught. Get to the spirit of a student. Find out what their light is and encourage that. You know what I mean? That was for me teaching. The information you get is secondary. It's bringing out what's within. That's what this book is about on Seba. So Plato is creating an artificial thing called the form, but this thing has a big hold on Western thought. Big hold, because he's drawn from a heavy idea that he's distorted and despiritualized. So according to Plato, the form can only be known through reason, and the highest form is good. You get it? And reason is separate from spirit. There is no spirit in here. It is pure, de-spiritualized thought. But the intellectuals of the Western world pick this up and run with it. A few dissent. But by and large, this plays a big role in terms of shaping how Western scholars, I don't care on what level they're coming from, view the world and view scholarship and view science and everything else. So Plato also is creating within the good, which I referred to last week, is a separation of good from bad, or dichotomy. And dichotomy is also for the purpose of hierarchy. People on top, those on the bottom. And so for him, good is separate from bad. This is the dichotomous thinking. And Western thought operates on this. And if we aren't careful, some of us have fallen into this. But our concept of the spiritual blues is very different. Bad is good. What's physical is spiritual. How many times you hear a black person say, baby, I'm up in here getting my feet worked on, and a sister talking about, baby, the spirit just told me. You know what I mean? That's a national anthem for black people. The spirit told me. Yeah. And if the spirit didn't tell you, whatever they told you wasn't right, well, too bad. You know what I mean? If you happen to be that person, too bad, So this separation of good and bad creates hierarchy, and what's on top is better than what's below. And this is a false dichotomy. I was saying before last week that on the earth plane, good contains bad, bad contains good. I was quoting the African American folk view that in the best of us, there's bad, and the worst of us, there's good. That's profundity when you understand that. Because I don't care how good someone is, how right they are, what a fine human being they are, we all got shortcomings. I mean, that's just reality. And this is also, that's also the philosophy of spiritual blues, or any of the systems of thought that are twin-based. It keeps you grounded in reality, and especially in your own reality, working on your own negatives to turn them into positives. But this isn't just a problem of good being separate from bad, absolutes, creating absolutes, which is also good for control, because then if you can label a group of people, for example, as bad, you're justified in going after them. And that's pretty much how this country sells war. These are the bad guys over here, when in fact they ain't doing what you said they're doing. They ain't got no weapons of mass destruction. destruction. But that seems to be a justification. If they did, why are you going over messing with them? You got more than anybody else. So when the Greeks stripped the Egyptian ideas of its spirit source, they also stripped it of its moral source. This is real key. For the Greeks, the idea of good derives from a thought system. And by the way, I'm getting into something here that's just the tip of the iceberg. We don't study European or European American philosophy. A few probably have, but most of us don't. We confine ourselves to this realm called white supremacy. And that's important. And I don't use the term, you know why, I've discussed it before. They ain't supreme anymore. That's their term to begin with. Define them in your terms. You might use Bobby Wright's terms, psychopathic racist personality. You might use that. Though you might have to redefine what psychopathic means, because if this culture is grounded in that, then that might be your way of using Freudian psychology to explain something that's even worse. You know what I mean? But the point is, come up with your explanation. Quit using theirs. And they feel good about white supremacy. Supreme. You're in a culture of control, baby. Oh, I'm supreme. Really? That's a myth, a pure myth. Your butt's getting kicked everywhere. And Western people have confused power with superiority. And power is temporary. Whether you're an athlete and you a boxer, you only have the energy for so long, you know, or you're a society. Your power is only going to exist for so long. What goes up comes down. That's the nature of it. If you're going to rest what's great about you on some fictitious idea of superiority, you're crazy. You know what I mean? Huh? Someone's going to come along sooner or later that's stronger than you. That doesn't prove they're superior. But you do need power. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying get out of the power game. Oh, yeah, you need some power. But if it's got a moral essence underneath it, a spiritual essence underneath it, and it's combined with all those other things you need to be strong in the world, then you are really strong. You know what I mean? So, key thing to get straight is when P.A.P.O talks about how the Greeks materialized Egyptian thought, one of the areas that was real key is in the area of ethics. Because when Plato talked about the good in the form, the good, he wasn't talking about a moral concept. He didn't mean morals, you know? And the reason is, and this is, you've heard me say this briefly before, but most of you don't know this, Aryan or European thought is teleological. It's not moral. What does teleological mean? It means it's use-oriented. Teleological, T-E-L-E-O-L-O-G-I-C-A-L. T-E-L-E-O-L-O-G-I-C-A-L. Of course, it's got to be logical in there. Huh? What does use orientation mean? What it means is, in Greek and in Aryan thought in general, it is the achieving of an objective that is defined as good. So if a Greek person, and this was common for the Greeks and this is common for the Americans, enslaved somebody, that's good for them and good for the slave. They don't care about the slave, you know? So it's achieving an objective. America's philosophy of the Europeans is pragmatism. It has no morals in it. It's all about what they claim works, and it ain't worked very well, you know? So in previous shows, I went through a brief analysis of the Aryan, but I went through a definition of the word good. And I showed you that in no Aryan language did good mean truthful, just, kind, right. Good in all Aryan languages meant the same thing. The strong is good, the weak is bad. And so what it's telling you is, in usefulness or utility, power is the ultimate source. And that's why Nietzsche, who is, I think, the most brilliant of the modern Aryan thinkers, coined his philosophy as will to power. You know, that's the driving force of Western thought. If you look at America, America's founded on that. Every institution is founded on one thing: power. You hear me? One thing. Everything else is bull. If you believe it, you're a fool. Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who fought in the Civil War, one of the most important legal minds this country has produced, when asked what governs the decisions of the Supreme Court, he said, it's the power of the strongest forces in society that determine that. That's why the Supreme Court never opposed slavery. It was outlawed by executive order and then amendments to the Constitution, but it didn't come from the Supreme Court. Why? It was governed by the most powerful forces in society. You hear me? And now that these forces are going down, that is white people, they're doing everything they can. And you know, Trump did a pretty good job of stacking the court with 3 hardcore right wingers headed by the most brainwashed black you ever saw, Clarence Uncle Tom Thomas. You hear me? Who has never seen a bad decision that he didn't like that was against blacks, against poor, against everybody. He only made, as far as I know, one good decision on the Supreme Court, and that's when he opposed the burning of a flag, the Confederacy on somebody's lawn. That's because that brought up memories of his Southern upbringing. He's a Geechee by nature, ashamed of his own accent and stuff, So the point is, power and control is the essence of the Aryan impulse, as I call it. You know what I mean? That is their essence. And so teleologically, being a people who are teleologically oriented, then it means what is useful. And usually what is useful is what you get through imposing your power on something and controlling it. And that's good. So it's not ethical. Pointed out before, in the Greek language, there is no word for right or ought. No word for right or ought. So Maat doesn't get figured very heavily in Greek thought. Why? It's contrary to their ethos, which is to make things work. That's another thing about how the environment is being approached teleologically. We'll fix this, fix that, and keep this same messed up system that has caused all the imbalances on the planet. We'll even let people buy, corporations buy credits so they can emit, but, someone else won't. We'll give them some money and they won't. What kind of control of protecting the environment is that? That's preserving the problem, So when we go through the meaning of good, then ethics is out, but you and I will misinterpret this because we'll think when somebody's saying good, it means the same thing. No, it doesn't. You have to view it through a cultural lens. Now, hierarchy or being on top, therefore, in this system is the greatest good in Western thought and in Greek thought in its origins. If you look at Plato's concept of the republic, which is the ideal state, who's on top? Those who reason without intuition. Who's on the bottom? The people who do the work. You know what I mean? And they're supposed to just follow orders. And it's all unilineal, meaning each person does one thing. Kind of like some of these boring jobs you have to do, But the key point is hierarchy is the whole thing, being top dog. This is what's really worship. This is the highest ideal. And if you look at Greek thought, the Greeks could never create a state and a nation the way the Kemites did, because they were all warring against each other. And if you look at Europe, it's been the same thing. That's what contributed to the rise of Africa, the rise of Asia, the bloody wars that they fought, especially the last two, you know. And when we have trouble with their intervention in Africa, it's when at least a pecking order has been established in Europe. And so they're not as bloody against each other, so they can go out and shed somebody else's blood. So we got caught in that bind, that they were no longer in conflict. And then it gave them opportunities to do things. And then we had made mistakes. We had not got the technological thing. We had come up with the smelting of iron. We had come up with astrophysics. We had come up with high mathematics, but we didn't tool up. Got to stay in touch with the world and tool up. You got to have what they got and more. You know what I mean? Because if not, somebody's going to be a predator, come in and take what you want, what you got. And that's the reality for you right now. Protect yourself. Ain't nobody else going to do it. Protect yourself. Now, when Plato's idea of despiritualized reason is tied to the Aryan idea of control, which Plato was an Aryan, then what you have is a real philosophical basis for the control of nature through science, a despiritualized science. And so what we see is the despiritualized project becomes a European project, meaning it's a lot more complex than this. There's a lot more to this. I'm just giving you a summary. But the key point is it's got to do with how do we correct this imbalance that's throwing the earth off course. So what we find is this materialistic orientation, this despiritualized orientation, becomes the basis for science controlling nature. It becomes the basis for reason being put in charge, despiritualized reason of economics, where there's really no concern about the people. This becomes the basis for psychology being despiritualized. This is the basis for revolutionary Western politics, the Russian Revolution, for example, being despiritualized. Plato despiritualized reason, reducing God to the lower realm, below thinking, non-intuiting white people. And I'm going to tell you something. Reason's fine, but theory, for example, which is a part of reason, that's fine, but it's a guess. And 9 out of 10 times it's got as much right and wrong in it because it's segmented, because it's just coming from the head, nothing else. It's not whole. And I'm not putting down theory. I'm saying you can look at it, but the reality is until you test it, does it work? Is it real? Does it conform to reality? But the point is, this despiritualization project that Plato plays a big role in, and others as well, reduces God to the realm of being subordinate to non-intuiting man. And by the way, Hegel, who is an architect of white racism, and is the primary thinker who comes up with this intellectual conception of African history, where he puts Egypt into the spirit of Asia and tries to remove it from African history. One of his main projects is reason, and his whole idea that it's only Western man that can reason. And this is a justification for going out and controlling people, when in fact, philosophy or deep thought has its origin in African people. The deepest science and everything else. But the point is, he is reducing African people to the realm of non-thinking, savage, uncivilized, but he does it in an elaborate way that becomes a key part of Western historiography. And it's his despiritualized reason that he claims only white people have that provides the justification for doing it in other people, along with, of course, his reasoning of racism. So despiritualization becomes like the key project of the Western world, not only in the area of science that affects nature, but in all realms of Western culture. But in a lot of these realms, they play a direct role on the way in which Western or Aryan man treats nature. So what we have then is Plato despiritualizes reason, reducing God to the lower realm, free of intuition, reason free of intuition. Adam Smith despiritualized reason, stripping economics of any spirit dimension. You might say, well, what kind of spirit dimension can you have in economics? Well, guess what? The communal order was based on the idea that land, air, and water was there for everybody. That's spirit-based, baby. Meaning nobody owns it. Everybody gets an access to it. Therefore, you don't have extremes of poverty. You know, that's a spirit dimension. Descartes, who was both a mathematical physicist from France, but he is also the person who lays out the logical thinking paradigm for the French and for Western man. He treats mathematical physics as though it's a material science. And he says he doesn't care about what the source of energy is, what is its nature. He only wants to use it for power and control. You hear me? Control over nature, and as he said, over the lower regions. That means Africa, Asia, Latin America, any people of color. And of course, if he can get away with it, if the French got more power over other Europeans as well. John Locke strips politics of any spirit dimension, reducing government to a system designed to protect private property. And that's what you're facing right now. Look at this debate you've got on infrastructure and all the stuff that Biden had loaded on it. Look how Manchin is coming in there, speaking for the fossil fuel industry and others, you know, and his ally, to strip it of any human benefit in the name of, he said, saving money. But they didn't stop Trump's tax cut for the rich. You know what I mean? And Biden's at least trying to pay for this in some kind of way. They didn't care about pay, just reward the rich. That was it. That's about all Trump did when he was in office, other than stack the Supreme Court and talk a lot, you know? So Isaac Newton, if we look at Newton, he revolutionized physics and the natural sciences by reducing the physical universe to a mathematical equation. That's also what Descartes and others did. And of course, there's power in this because some of these equations, they're quite accurate. But it's for the purpose of control. I'm not knocking, by the way, science. I'm knocking the despiritualization of science. So get that straight. Science is important, you know. Freud despiritualized psychology by reducing psychology to a rational social science free of intuition. This was a big difference he had with Carl Jung, who had been a student, you know, somebody that had been influenced by his thinking. Jung was spiritual. He was into things that some of you all ain't into, like astrology. Synchronicity, you know, the idea that two things happening at the same time, that ain't a coincidence. And he wrote a lot. He was deep. But Freud said, we must remove the intuitional from psychology. If you go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist and start talking about astral flight and stuff like that, if they're not in a certain domain and you're in New York, you just might find yourself in a straitjacket. I'm joking, but I'm serious, You know what I mean? In other words, these realms are, suspicious at the least, and viewed as sick or crazy, too often. So psychology. And then in revolution, Lenin, who was a prolific writer and the principal leader of the first phase of the Russian so-called revolution, he put forward this idea: there can be no revolutionary movement without a revolutionary theory. This is theory minus intuition. And by the way, a major weapon that the Russian Communist Party, now, I'm not anti-communist, so don't misinterpret this. I'm not a communist. I'm not a Marxist, but I'm not anti it either. I'm not putting it down per se. I have my own critical analysis of it, but I ain't putting it down, But the key point is, so when Lenin takes the position that you can't have a revolutionary movement without a revolutionary theory minus intuition, the Communist Party of Russia used terror as a major weapon for controlling the people. Terror. And terror without directing it at a source because that source was wrong, was an oppressor or something like this, but just to maintain power. So what makes them different from the Tsar? A lot of talk, but the walk was pretty much the same. And don't talk about Stalin. When he gets in, he's killing everything in sight. The boy just gained great pleasure from having power over people. His secretary was a little mousy Russian. He just took his wife and put her in a gulag just to do it. This guy had to come to work to deal with this sucker every day. When he had locked his wife up and all he ever did was take notes, do whatever he was told to do. You understand? So again, taking spirit out, it's dehumanizing, And here's the final point. And I'm telling you, my book goes into this in great detail. This is just a little tip of the iceberg. When we talk about a despiritualized science used to control nature, and the primary cause for throwing nature out of balance and global warming and everything else, the primary architect of this is a man who was not a scientist, but who popularized the scientific method of empirical observation. And he was somebody out to dethrone certain aspects of Plato's thought, though he bought into the de-spiritualized reason thing big time. That was Francis Bacon, whose books are among the dullest books you could ever read, but had a profound effect on Western thought, particularly scientific method, and though he was not a scientist. And so what was his approach? He said, and this goes back to the problem when you have man who doesn't have a synthesis inside himself with the feminine. He's got the same grievance that most Aryan men or Western men have with the female. I'm not saying they all don't like women, but the female and the feminine. So he regarded nature as a female. And what did he say? His empirical method was one of observation of nature, which you could say, what's wrong with that? Nothing. You know what I mean? Per se. You're supposed to observe things and study things. What's wrong with it, though, is two things. One, he's viewing nature as without spirit and therefore a material force that he can just simply move on. But he says that empirical science is for the purpose of observing nature to uncover its secrets, for the purpose of control and domination, and get this one, to create a new nature. That's GMOs, genetically modified nature. You hear me? Well, once they put those manufactured seeds in the ground, you can't put a seed in the ground anymore. Means you got what nature gave you for free, you got to go to the major corporations to buy it. So then you can't afford a seed, then you can't afford to live. They could care less. You hear me? So This is the mad philosophy of science, the mad general philosophy of the Western world that imperils the earth right now. And that's why there's got to be a shift on a whole lot of levels. And in this one, it's a philosophical shift that will then impact the thinking shift, that will then impact the behavior shift, and that can then restore some balance to a planet that's been shifted out of balance. So Mother Nature's in a crisis, driven on the surface by the Industrial Revolution. And the technical imbalances this has caused through the Industrial Revolution we've already talked about, therefore require technical measures, to correct them. Wind and solar are among them, electric things another, and there are a lot of others. So those are needed, and I'm not saying they aren't. But the key thing we need is a shift from a de-spiritualized science to a spirit science that acknowledges that nature is a composite composed of matter and spirit, and that science is guided by that. The philosophy of Maat, or the philosophy of harmony and truth, has to guide this project of planetary salvation, because Mother Nature and the cosmos are delicate entities whose balance can only be restored through the delicate handling of nature, the way the mother nurtures a child. And that's not to say that nature's not Big Mama. It's not to say that there's not a lot we can learn from nature. I'm not saying that. I'm just simply saying that handling nature is a general proposition. And the way it's been handled has been rough and savage. And that's put us in this position, just as the handling of humanity has been rough and savage, just as the handling of women has been rough and savage. The handling of children has been rough and savage, So it requires a different kind of human being. So the spiritual blues, where the spirituals are the blues and the sacred is secular, is a philosophy of the artistic scientist. And I want you to note what I'm doing here. For all of you who say you don't have a culture, or slavery did us so much damage, yeah, it did, but we also came out pretty strong. And we could come up with some of this stuff here, where our stuff can actually save the planet. Then we better really appreciate this black stuff while we're drawing from its source this African stuff. You know what I'm telling you? Understand your strengths while we overcome the weaknesses. I'm not romanticizing. I mean, we got all kinds of issues. That's why we got the 6-fold stages to mental freedom. I've gone through mine. You know what I mean? We all got them. I'm not denying it. But I'm saying you got one heck of a culture. You hear me? That inside you and inside your culture is a very salvation of the planet. Of course, Native Americans could say that. A lot of other people who are coming from strong spirit material cultures could say that too. But I'm talking about us, and I'm saying this is a salvation kind of thing. So spirit science is an artistic science that arises from the souls of Black folks. And its highest manifestation is expressed through the world's greatest scientist of the 20th century, George Washington Carver, who was a painter, a musician, a singer, a multidimensional scientist, including botanist, and drew on all kinds of areas of science, and an earth healer. He's a model for this, an ex-slave, so-called, you hear me, who loved being Black and who loved, first of all, Black folks and humanity. Didn't do anything for money. He did it to uplift people. So if we're to understand what this spirit science is, then let's just get a few things straight about George Washington Carver. He described his science not as a despiritualized science. He called it I'm quoting him, a creative science. Remember what I said before, our ethos as new Africans is creativity. This is the manifestation of the highest level on the realm of science in the world. You hear me? And because it's a creative science, it's not a destructive science. It's creative because it fuses spirit with matter. It's creative because it's practitioners. In this case, George Washington Carver, there are many others, and this applies to the culture as a whole, not just the science. They're grounded in humility. George Washington Carver was a humble human being. And being humble and being a good person who was using his talents to serve humanity, he was wide open to God's mind and God's thoughts. And that's what he called it. His creative science, as he said, was piping into the thoughts of God. He said when he went into a scientific laboratory at 3 a.m, he went by himself. He had no books. He was simply open to God's mind. You hear me? And he came up with so many inventions that it's funny. You can't even count all of them. George Washington Carver described creative science as this: I'm quoting him, taking abstractions and making them concrete. When I was talking about Dogon philosophy, that's the 7th numo. You know, when you fuse the masculine and feminine, then that's called perfection. And what distinguishes the 7th numo, who is the entity made up of both masculine and feminine qualities, 4 of the sexual components of the female, 3 of the male, is they're able to take ideas that you can't see up there in heaven, bring them down to earth and make them work. And Dogon thought, they give birth to housing. They give birth to all kinds of things that improve human life. But don't trample on it, and don't trample on Mother Nature. In the spiritual blues, Professor Carver followed an African-American cultural ethos. And he wasn't raised among a whole lot of Black people, but it was in him, you know? And he had this saying where, and this was his research assistant, and I'm paraphrasing what he said. He said, Professor Carver's philosophy of science, and I call the philosophy of spirit science, because he drew his inspirations from God, from the spirit in him, but he had gifts. And so he was being nurtured by God to use his gifts. And so he described the meaning of creative science. And by the way, this is the same meaning that you'll find artists and musicians and people in every realm of Black life, they say the same thing, except he applied it to his thing, which is to make the ugly beautiful. That's basically what inspired us to recreate this culture here in this beautiful spiritual blues art form, which, by the way, includes a whole lot of stuff. So in describing how he made the ugly beautiful, to paraphrase him, he said he would take waste and make it beautiful and useful. He would take what was discarded from the junkyard and turn it into scientific instruments, because he didn't have a lot of money for his scientific equipment, so he made it. He would take a plant that was nearly dying and heal it. He said it never did a plant die in his hands. Or a sick animal and heal him, or a sick human being. He would take a shack that Black sharecroppers lived in, where sometimes the space between wood, you could almost walk out between them. You know what I understand? And he would make paint to beautify the ugly. And his favorite paint was, check this one out. I'm ending on this one, because we started with how the Greeks distorted Egyptian thought, what did he do? He created Egyptian blue, paint that lasted 40 or 50 years, so that a poor black farmer's shack could be turned into a sanctuary of beauty. So the salvation of the planet, literally, needs to be based on a shift of philosophy, a shift of thought, a shift of behavior from a despiritualized one to one of the spiritual blues, where sacred and secular are not separate, but are linked because that's the way it is. And in doing this, we can enhance the beauty of Mother Nature and put a smile on God's face. Of course, I know God's not a human being, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean? Every time God hears the beauty coming from the souls of Black folks or the souls of any people who are doing good, God brightens up. That's what I'm told, you know. So a little offering here. I hope you got something out of it. It's your stuff. Study it and use it. Hotep. Let's see if we got anything. James, okay, Ogara, these are conversations that y'all are having here. James P.A.P.O, you should have kept that up. Information is needed. Okay, let's see. James P.A.P.O, answer, altered state of consciousness. Okay. Okay, there's a question here by Brother Ogawa, who's helping me out a lot. He said, question, can a person develop a meditative strategy to further their connection to the source, God? How can a person develop that strategy? I think different people here could probably share what they do to go inside themselves. Generally, the meditative route comes largely from India and places like that, which have mixed Aryan thought with African thought. And a lot of the African stuff is real strong. Some of the Aryan stuff is another story, but meditation obviously has real value. I would say that if you go back to some of the stuff I was dealing with, the powers within, and if you look at what the Kemites and other people, both Chinese and Japanese, but the Kemites define as heart, mind, that's what you need to be in communion with, because that's the place inside the human being where God exists. And this whole stripping of mind from intuition is denial of the reality that these are not separate, you know. So it's working on that, the hati, which is the place where the heart mind sits. And it's the higher mind of God that sits there. So that's part of it. I think part of it is, if you're using meditation, one source of meditation that's very good is your ka, or your ori, your destiny. What are you here for? Work on that. Because the more you concentrate on that, the more you polish that, first of all, you got to identify it, then the higher, your growth is going to be. And so meditation should be rooted in African spirit system. I'm not saying I don't learn from anybody else. Native Americans have the vision quest, where it was more than meditation. That was finding your life purpose. And they would go out, and often a young person would be prepared by the priest and then sent to a spot, usually on a mountain, where they'd stay for so many days until they underwent an experience where the spirit visited them and gave them the message of their purpose. Crazy Horse, one of the greatest warriors of the Lakota people, he had a vision of him riding a crazy horse, that is a spirited horse. And he also had a vision of how he could be protected in battle. So this was helping him with his. Africans during slavery, we only know this after slavery because this was all secret stuff during slavery, would go to graveyards and places like that and go through meditation. And sometimes children, you have to read the slave narratives to pick this up. Children would be sleeping sometimes, say on Monday in class, because this is during Reconstruction and post Reconstruction, and education is very valuable. They'd ask them, why were they sleeping? Well, they were out to find their spirit in a graveyard, but they were communing with uh, souls that have departed for their own purpose in life. So I would, meditation, I think, has got a lot to do with working on your personal gifts, your ori, your ka. What are you here for? And working on refining that, polishing that. Okay, let me see if there's some other stuff here. Robe Jam, if I'm lying, we've been on this planet longer than white people. Prove me wrong. No, that's correct. 144,000 years ago, second or third millennium BC for uh, presence of whites. Rob John, I'm here to tell everyone in the chat that you are angels. Okay. Trying to see if there's any questions here. Some comments, but any questions? This is Brother Ugawa. He says, James Poe, today's class is so wonderful because it combines so many themes that he's touching on from the last 50 plus classes with more meat on some and new explanations on others. Yeah. A lot of this is inner conversation, so I'm not repeating it. Okay. There's a discussion here. Rob James. Joe Biden called them white supremacists. Police officer that was attacked called them domestic terrorists. I just want to say racist. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. A lot of inner conversation here, which I understand is the nature of a chat. Bruce Watkins, my father said these two ideas years ago. Yes, we manifest those ideas in our thoughts. You must stay in the truth and be who you are. Yeah, true. He's dealing with this idea that your thoughts are you. Let's see if there's anything else here. Okay, there's a comment here. This is, I think, an inner comment as a response. You shall definitely watch other shows because you're confusing spirit and body, ka and ba and kemet. Yeah, I have some shows where I deal with these different things. Let me see if there's anything else here. James P.A.P.O, Biden's materialism caused him to discount the political efficacy of fighting for democracy, fairness, and the environment. Yeah, I mean, he's put voting rights issues way down on the bottom and maintaining the core of the Senate, which goes back to slavery on a higher level. Yeah, true. And while there are provisions in his bill for the environment, they could be much stronger. Bruce Watkins, yes, yes, the Industrial Revolution. But Mother Earth is so resilient. It is changing every day and fighting back. Spirit of our planet, we see this happening more. Yeah, that's a good point. But it needs help. Mother Earth needs help from the people that's throwing it out of balance and those opposed to them doing it. A very good point. James P.A.P.O, we must deconstruct the materialist philosophy that sustains ecocide. Yeah, true. And then Stephen McKenzie, I answered this while I was talking on fossil fuels and plants and animals and what do they contribute. Is there anything else? Okay. See, there's a new one on the bottom, and then I think we're finished here. Lao Tzu, Hotep, Dr. Oba, is the website up for ordering books? Yes. If you go to the click in, when you go to this show, look at the bottom, and there's a click in for ordering books. Um, okay. Okay, I think that's it. That's it. So I hope you got something out of this. Until next week, Hotep.